Welcome to everybody for this webinar put on by Bellwether Education Partners with a terrific group of 4 panelists who I'm going to let, in the interest of time, introduce themselves a little bit in by way of when they answer the questions. We're super grateful to all 4 of them for making time. This is a really busy time, whether you're an organization leader or a frontline educator, and so having both on the call is terrific. I want to start. I don't want to belabor. What we're going to do is have some conversation with them. You all will be able to, the audience will be able to submit questions, which we will then around half past the hour start to ask the panelists those. So please participate that way. Hey, Sonja, please participate that way. But let me start with Nina and Dan for the big national picture. What did you all see when this started? What was the reaction from school districts, Dan, and from charter schools, Nina? And what did you see that you found encouraging, and what in the initial reactions first few weeks has concerned you?
Thank you so much, Andy. I want to first take a moment to recognize Bellwether for putting this great panel together with such a diverse and esteemed group of panelists. So I'm humbled to be on this session, and I think it's great to have more dialogue around these issues. In terms of what we saw in the charter school community was a real interest in doing everything that we could, not only to serve the needs of our own students, but also to see if we could open up access to our resources to the larger education community. Some of these stories have already been told. You have Eva Moskowitz from Success Academy on this panel, who's going to talk a little bit about the resources she's made available to the larger community, but there are other networks that did the same, such as Uncommon Schools, KIP. There's a great piece in the 74 by Robin Lake at the Center for Reinventing Public Education, which has taken a look at the practices that traditional districts have put in place. I think she looked at about 82 school districts and 18 charter school management organizations. Out of the 18 management organizations, it appears as if 16 of them put something in place almost immediately. So the nimbleness of the charter sector certainly affords it the ability to do certain things that a large district may not be able to do very quickly. But overall, we've been very pleased with just the cooperation and sense of unity by the entire education space, whether it's public, charter, or magnet, or private.
So Nina, in terms of the field response that you're seeing frontline in terms of serving kids on a scale 1 to 10, if 10 is business as just usual, just another day at the office, and 0 is absolute catastrophe, what number would you assign where we are right now?
Well, we haven't done a survey of everyone. As you know, a good majority of charter schools are, single-site operated schools. We are discussing ways to see if we can dig a little deeper to do the same type of work that SERPI did with large CMOs. But by and large, in terms of the feedback we've received from our state association partners, there's a great need for computers and the support you need around offering online learning to students. It's not enough just to give them a Chromebook. You have to do teacher training. And this is, again, why it's great to have Eva on this call. A lot of entities have just made some links available to students and to their parents in order to do online learning, and online learning is, quite frankly, a lot more challenging and complex than that. Other than that, anecdotally, I haven't seen anything. I was in discussions last week with Earl Fallon, with Fallon Schools, which is a network of charter schools in several states, and that's probably a more typical charter school in that he immediately offered grab-and-go food services to his families, as well as homework packets, and he needed computers in order to take the work to the next level. So I would imagine a lot of them are in that boat right now, which is why the stimulus money coming down the pike is going to be really important.
Okay, that wasn't a number, that was like calculus. But thank you. Dan, to you, same question. What are you seeing nationally, the response? What are you seeing that's encouraging, and what are you seeing that's concerning? And same thing, on a scale 1 to 10, how would you rate the response of where the field is right now?
Well, the initial concern really had to do with a major switching from what K-12 public education has been, which is face-to-face learning in a classroom, to online learning. And the reality is that for the majority of school districts in this country, they were not ready to switch from to online learning from face-to-face education. A lot of it had to do, as we know, the inequity that exists in our school systems today, that a lot of it is determined by the wealth of the community. So those schools in the community that had the resources and had already equipped their kids for one-to-one and had already trained their teachers and had already had the software were able to make the switch fairly quickly. But then those districts that don't, districts where the majority of the students are students of poverty who didn't have the computer, and many of these students, even if they had the computer, don't have the internet connectivity in the house, well, that became and still is a major problem. So the switch from face-to-face learning to online learning has been an issue and will continue to be an issue for quite a while. The second concern that our superintendents had was that a lot of these youngsters, again, the issue of poverty, a lot of these youngsters were dependent on the school in terms of being provided with a breakfast, a lunch, and a snack. And what were we going to do to feed those students? And indeed, school districts immediately jumped on it and provided, thanks to the agriculture department, by the way, for so quickly allowing these school lunches to be served other than in the school cafeteria. So immediately locations were identified where families could come and get those lunches, and that has been going on. So those two issues were the first issues that developed. And again, the district moved quickly to deal with it. The feeding of the students probably easier than the online has been. But as this has progressed to the point of we're seeing almost every school system in the country shut down, and many of them now saying that they're going to be shut down till the end of the school year, there are other issues that are developing. One of the main ones that I was just talking to a group of superintendents this morning is how to deal with college-bound students who need to have grades, and need to have transcripts, and need to have a diploma, go to higher education. The Assistant Secretary of the Army contacted me and said, I have thousands of high school students that have enlisted to join the Army, but I can't take them unless they have a diploma in hand. So those issues are issues that districts are now trying to deal with, how to grade their students. A lot of the universities are asking for just a pass as opposed to a grade, but a lot of states require a grade. So that's becoming an issue. And we're almost at the point now where we're beginning to think ahead. What are we going to do over the summer? What are we going to do in September? And now I'm beginning to hear from a lot of districts, 2 states, Sonja's Maryland being one of them, where your Secretary of Education, Superintendent of Education, indicated that you may not be ready to open in the fall. And the state of Washington has said a similar thing. So all of a sudden, we're now cycling into not just the remainder of this year, which I think everybody has pretty much agreed the year is over, to the next year, and will there be a next year? So those are the big issues. Now, in terms of your question, when you consider day-to-day instruction in a classroom with a live teacher to what's going on now, I wouldn't go beyond the 5 on an average nationwide.
And I want to come back to this issue in a minute of all the kids who are completely disconnected, because we're hearing a lot about the online and these things, but there's a lot of kids who aren't getting any education at all. But why don't we stay, Sonja, you want to talk about how this is being experienced in Baltimore, and particularly some of the steps you immediately took around, like you're using public television to deliver ELA and things like that, and sort of take us down to the ground and sort of how, running a large, complicated urban district, you all responded and what you're thinking about right now.
Sure. And I think one of the things I too want to say thank you. It's great to be on a panel with such diverse folks and great thinking. A lot of what has already been said is also true in Baltimore at scale. I think one of the things that Dan just said, which was true, is given the large numbers of students, we're talking about 80,000 in Baltimore City, and clearly I have colleagues who serve more. But the big piece for us was very quickly, we went to what are some of kind of the essential first steps. And for us, it was feeding, like you've heard already. But even a school lunch program that is probably one of the smoothest operating infrastructure points within an urban school district gets taxed when you are talking about not just feeding children, feeding families, when you're talking about moving from 1 meal a day to now approval from the USDA to give kids 4 meals a day. And so for our community, we knew immediately that being able to put that in place was essential. So that was one of our first priorities. The other piece, which again is true, and I think, Nina even referenced this for the charter school community, that, this is a time where really thinking about what's happening on the ground, starting with the user first and moving backwards versus starting with the bureaucratic infrastructure and moving out, I think has benefited us. And very quickly, I think all schools and education leaders moved to this. And so for us, we knew that our device to student, as Dan referenced, our device to student ratio was 1 to 4. And so we were not going to be able to, with 2 days notice, lift to go to 1-to-1. So we immediately began looking at what are the other options for communicating across a district. And so, one of the advantages of having just adopted new ELA and math curriculum was we were actually able to partner with Great Minds and actually stand up fairly quickly with only a week or two do so online lessons. We partnered with Great Minds. They aligned their lessons. And so we have been able, particularly for our earliest learners, our pre-K and elementary students, to use cable television and to make sure that lessons are up. Families have access to that because we knew we could not only rely on Chromebooks. And yes, we are, we're putting in orders and shifting funds. But as Dan referenced, we had to prioritize. So we have been prioritizing our high school students, particularly our juniors and seniors, to make sure they have what they need in place for graduation. But it really has been all hands on deck. We've partnered with the city in our feeding so that it's not just the school system and other partners. So this piece, I think, has really pushed kind of notions of traditional ways of delivering instruction and traditional ways of meeting the needs of kids. And so we've really had to kind of expand our universe of who is helping. But we know, for example, that there are large numbers of young people who we have to connect with in a different way. And so for some of that, it's frankly very low tech. It's teachers. We had one of our high school teachers who posted the first day school was out, the first day without complete school, posted on Instagram and got 85% of her high school students logging in with her because they follow her on Instagram. And so what we've done is we've used some of those folks who are far more adept with technology, with connecting, to then help train their peers. But it's been a lift of how do we narrow the band of young people who aren't reached, and then very quickly come in to make that personal contact.
All right, thank you. Eva, coming to you, you run a network of schools across New York City, which is obviously one of the parts of our country that's been hardest hit, has more cases, as I think, than any other country right now at this point, just by itself. Everywhere I go right now, or I guess I should say everywhere I go virtually right now, I hear people talk about Success Academy and what you guys are doing, and people take a look at what they've done up there. I hear that again and again. So can you talk about what have you done? What was the mindset, the approach behind it, and what specifically did you do to continue education during this unusually disruptive time for you all?
Sure. And so we have 18,000 students, not quite as many as Sonja has or Dan represents, but 18,000 students, K to 12. The majority of our kids are in elementary across 45 campuses. And, our challenges are, it's not just disruption, unfortunately. The communities we serve are the most impacted by the fatalities. And so our crisis support has been in quadruple over time just to support the deaths that our kids unfortunately are experiencing. So there's that part of it, but obviously from a teaching and learning perspective, what was really important to us insofar as it was possible is not just to have links for kids, but really to stand up virtual schools. We have the benefit that we were largely digital already, 4 to 12, even though, we get less money than our district counterpart, but we had made that investment in the technology. And so in 4 to 12, we are doing all of our units just the way we would do them. We're doing project-based learning, we're doing our literacy units, our math units. K to 3 was more challenging because we don't have a one-to-one. We soon will, but don't have it yet. And what we decided to do there was really focus and prioritize reading and do the conferencing that we would also do in a bricks and mortar school. So, we have a long school day and we are educating our kids, and we have had some interesting findings that we're able to do certain things actually better in this context. Obviously, we miss hugging the kids, we miss the community that is formed when you have your community meeting. But we are able to take some of our best teachers, for example, our 7th grade math teacher, and use that person to do the launch and the discourse, and have our teachers that are still learning kind of watch that and spend more time giving students feedback. And so we've tried as best we can to make lemonade out of lemons.
And both Sonja and Eva, how are you finding out? Can you say a little more? How are you finding out what techniques you're using to find out day to day, week to week, what's working, what's not working, what's the feedback? How do you need to change things? What are you all doing?
Well, I can say that we are able to sort of parachute in much more easily than going to 45 campuses. So we are listening to the launch. With the younger ones, we are getting on those phone calls and FaceTimes to really see. And our teachers have planning meetings just the way they would in a bricks and mortar school. We have math planning meetings, we have literature planning meetings, science planning meetings, all of that is happening still. And so we can see the quality of those planning meetings. So that's what we do at Success.
Sure. So I think with ours, we're probably still a little earlier, still a little lower tech in that regard. And what I would say for Andy, one of the benefits of this has been far tighter adult planning, and our iterations. I was describing it to someone this morning. Our iteration cycles around practice have become a lot tighter because we've had to focus on key functions. So, for example, part of what helped us set up our cable lessons that we launched this week was the fact that we got a lot of feedback from teachers on their packets they put together before, right, for that first week when we got word on Thursday that school would be closed on Monday. And so some of what we've been doing is really, and our chief of schools, John Davis, has done an amazing job, is we have much tighter check-in schedules, one with principals, and we've really had to lean on some of the infrastructure we already had put in place for principal meeting and principal reporting. And it has made, because the visibility, because I have gone out, for example, to feeding sites and laptop distribution sites to be able to have eyes on the ground. But I think what we have had to do is very quickly get feedback from a variety of standpoints and then turn it around the next, very quickly. So instead of, discussions that might have normally taken 2 months, they now take 2 days, and we've got to make those shifts. So in our food distribution, We've iterated our standing operating procedures probably 2 or 3 times as the volume has increased. The other thing I will say is for some of it, the very low tech piece is just, for example, when we check in on kids, it is saying, this is the number, setting the target, this is the number of times young people and families need to be touched, and how successful were you at doing that? And then having a system where we literally get reports from teachers that then go to principals, that then come to area soups, and then get aggregated centrally. Where we can do that with technology, we do, but where we can't, it's reliant on, in some cases, phone logs for schools that are just getting up with that. So a lot of it has really forced, I would say, a different kind of planning. And then, some of the national associations, it's helpful to get on with other district leaders as well as leaders in other sectors. So that piece also helps shorten the learning cycle, because if I can learn from somebody who is 2 to 3 weeks ahead of me, just hearing Ava talk about being in New York, right, that is ahead of a curve, both for COVID as well as implementation, that's the kind of piece we've become far more attuned to as we put things in place. Like I just got off a call with Council of Great City Schools before this, and Miami-Dade is much further ahead on the curve. And so a lot of the things we're putting in place, we're checking with colleagues who are further along the curve.
And briefly, Sonja, just staying with you real briefly for a sec, one of the complaints we're hearing in a lot of communities is people are saying they want to go faster, the schools want to go faster, the central office is holding them back. Can you just talk a little bit about these urban school districts are like really complicated systems. So what are some of the constraints that you all are operating under that may not be visible to someone either a frontline educator or a parent that may not be visible to them, that are sort of constraining you guys and some of the obstacles you're bumping into?
Yeah, so some of the constraints, frankly, are just regulations. And not that I don't understand, I've spent time in the policy world. I understand where regulations come from. But I'll give you an example, just on feeding alone, right? Being able to know on the ground, we knew day 2 on the ground that 1 lunch per child was not going to work. We knew that when we set out, just based on being out of school for a week. But the fact that we had to wait for that release until we got a sign off, and let's be clear, it was a faster sign off than 85% of the other kind of, kind of legal or, procedural guidance. So that's kind of one thing. So, I had people calling me like, look, we can get boxes of food here. I can get people on the ground there. And, at some point, maybe I shouldn't say this in a national call, at some point you just make the call. And you go and you say, I'm going to make up for it later. And fortunately, we were fortunate that the federal guidance that came out later actually matched what we put in place. So, some of it is making those calls in real time. I think the other piece is, we had to make a decision that good could not be the enemy of perfect, right? We knew we were not going to get every family, every student on day 1. But that was not, for me, the license to say, we're just going to wait, right? So what we became comfortable with, very quickly was we knew that different schools were in different places. I had some schools who day 1 were ready to go. And so, the question became, how do you balance that, knowing you've got one parent on one side of the district whose school is ready to go, and you have another parent on another side of the district whose school isn't ready to go. And it has required, to be very blunt, some real flexible thinking on the part of, principal supervisors and others who are used to having to follow all of these dots. To be able to say, I need you to think in the moment. Like, I need you to be in tuned and be able to, frankly, have a different level of decision making. So we've pushed some boundaries. I'm fortunate that I land in a place that's okay after. But, this is one of those times where where a lot of that, and I don't want to call it bureaucratic red tape, but I have principals calling me saying, really, you want us to wait for X and Y? And I just had to say, go, just go, we'll cover you, do what you need to do. And it's been a lot of that, quite frankly.
All right, and that resonates. A lot of the incoming requests we've gotten from school districts at Bellwether for support have been around stuff like decision-making protocols, how to figure out who has decision rights, because that's now happening in a decentralized way, and often that stuff's held pretty close by superintendents, and so just processes and so forth. So that resonates. Dan and Nina, let's talk a little bit about like where we are now and going forward. And I'm really interested in your take on the CARES Act. It's hard to miss. It was a $2 trillion package, unprecedented historically, and yet education was a pretty small slice of that, despite the role of schools as a social and economic center in a lot of communities. Can you talk about why you think like schools weren't more represented in that? And then what do you want to see in what seems to be inevitably future stimulus packages as this situation wears on?
Well, let me jump in on that because we've been very much involved with that. We were very disappointed that this last CARES Act only provided $13.7 billion to education. Of course, every little bit helps, but that's nowhere near the amount. That's because now, along with 12 other national organizations, we have submitted a proposal to Congress for $200 billion. Because that's the amount of money that schools are going to need as we go forward into next year to deal with the many cost factors that have emerged in this process, from the cleaning of classrooms, the cleaning of schools, the feeding of our students above and beyond just the one lunch a day, the technology factor, the ability of districts to be able to have the technology. How do we solve the needs of all of those thousands and thousands of students who don't have connectivity in their home? There's a proposal there really to use the E-rate, which is very much capable of doing that with $2 billion. That was a request that was made in the last act, but was not approved, so that homes can have that connectivity. There's the issue of unemployment. Think about it as we go into this next school year, and if we're going to be continuing, and as I'm sure we probably will, this online instruction, well, what happens to the personnel that are not directly involved in working when schools are closed? How do you want to continue to pay them? It was interesting that this last act completely overlooked the needs of government workers and school district employees. We're taking care of the private sector in terms of allowances for pay and allowances for family leave, but did nothing to deal with the needs of public school employees, which, by the way, are the largest employee group in the country. So there's a lot of need there, a lot of thinking that has gone on. We're pushing that $200 billion package because it's really going to be needed to deal with all of these issues that have not been taken care of at this last time. The other point, if I may, and very quickly, a major concern that has developed right now, and Sonja can probably give you at the ground level look at that, is the IDEA, our special needs students. There isn't an educator, a teacher that doesn't want to do everything for those students that they deserve to have. But if schools are closed and you have the restrictions that you now have, and you have students that need the physical presence of a person to work with them, we can't send the teachers to the home of the students. And conversely, we can't have the students coming into the schools because the schools are supposed to be closed. So superintendents are acting and basically will be subject to violation of their civil rights of these students. The IDEA that is being conformed with, because that's what the law calls for, even though there's a pandemic going on and all of the issues that we have in place that prohibit us from physically doing those things. So those are two major.
And you don't think the guidance that Secretary DeVos has issued, is it not giving you all enough cover and what
it
you need?
It provides no cover at all. It talks about do the best that you can. Well, how do you do the best when you know you can't do it? The problem. And then are you going to be subject to lawsuit? Are you going to be subject to being out of compliance? because you're not doing what you want to do because you can't.
So what specifically do your members want from the department on that?
Flexibility. We want flexibility, short term. We're not looking for waivers. We're not looking for anything permanent, just short term flexibility that recognizes the situation that exists today. A perfect example, if a student is identified and there has to be an IEP developed within a certain period of time, how can that be done now? You can't. It can't be done. So
I think
recognize the realities and give flexibility to do it after there's the opportunity to do it.
So if I'm hearing you right, because I think like a lot of the debate, particularly you've seen on social media around this, has been about like serving kids, and people are saying, well, there's online schools that serve special ed kids. You're saying It's more about these procedural issues associated with getting IEP plans and all the timeline.
Absolutely. Exactly.
Right?
We're not talking about online. There's a lot of special ed students that can be served online, and they are being served online. But where there are procedures that require physical involvement and presence, that can't be done.
All right. Now, I don't know if you're going to share your $200 billion with Nina or not, but Nina.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. They're covered.
From the charter side, what do charters need here?
So first of all, I agree to a large extent with Dan around the need for more resources. I think this last relief package was seen as a Band-Aid to stop the bleeding around industries that were suffering immediately. The amount that we received was not as much as we should have received, but I hope that in the next relief package, we can definitely bump those numbers up. Just so folks know what that number is right now in the current relief package, it's about 80% of your Title I allocation. So that injection should be helpful. And again, we need more, but it's not insignificant. The other issue that I will just raise, I mean, in fairness to the department, I do think the waivers they put in place in order to get, tell states to have flexibility around testing was probably timely. The application that they've put together is fairly simple. So again, they're not doing everything perfectly, but there are some things that they've done well that we should recognize. I also think their website has some pretty valuable resources that, again, we don't have a national school board in this country and a national education system at times like these. Some of us wish there was a little bit more centralization, but absent that, I do think they've done the best that they can under the current circumstances. I think the issue with special ed, quite frankly, is a legal issue, and the special ed lobby and sector certainly are one of the constituents that the department is concerned about when it comes to offering, I don't know that waivers is the right term, but any kind of flexibility. So we just have to be cognizant of that. In terms of your question around what the charter sector needs, I'm glad that Dan is on the record that he's going to encourage school districts to share resources with us, but that's always been the key problem for charter schools. Charter schools only receive about 70 cents of every dollar that goes to traditional schools. In some jurisdictions, that number drops to 40 cents on the dollar. So the fact that we're not getting our full share, and we're not in many instances operating like a school district with bond authority and things of that nature, is definitely front and center. So we want to make sure that we are fully engaged in these discussions and fighting for the same thing. I will say on the online instruction and virtual and remote learning side, E-rate is really the key thing that we believe needs to be addressed immediately, so that those who are getting education at home can access it. And some of the regulations at the FCC are regulations that need to be lifted, and those are things that the FCC can do immediately, and I'm not quite sure why they're waiting for.
And that seems to be an area where there's agreement across the education sector. Eve, I see you.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in to say that obviously Corona is unprecedented, but I think, Andy, we really need to be thinking about this. The schools were not in such great shape before all of this. And that was not, that was sort of, there was disparate impact there on the quality of schooling, right? Our most vulnerable children were struggling to read and do math at grade level, etc. And then you have Corona, and as Dan mentioned, I am very concerned that we don't know when getting back to normal. What is that? When is that? The planning that we need to do to figure out how to make up for many, many years of perhaps poor education and then the loss of learning. I think that is going to add to just a very, very serious educational problem. And I wouldn't want us so focused on Corona that we forgot what we had before Corona, which was a pretty big educational problem, right? If you look at the NAEP scores, if you look at internationally, we were not doing so well before. And this is just sort of another kick in the gut. And we're going to have to be imaginative, even more imaginative than we were before. How are we going to get out of this? That worries me greatly.
Yeah, I mean, Warren Buffett always says about recessions that it's like at the beach when the tide goes out, you find out who was swimming naked. And I think like you could say the same thing about the education system, like something like, and the healthcare system for that matter, like something like this, like reveals like all these vulnerabilities that people who weren't necessarily, you know, working on them day to day may not have been aware of. All these problems become very apparent. On that, just picking up on that, and this is a question to all of you. One of the audience members has a question that essentially is that given the unprecedented nature of these times, the immediate demands on kids for sort of health, connection, security, SEL, and so forth, is this the time education leaders should be thinking big about like redesigning the system because of all these other things? And then, or the person says, is this actually the best time because once this passes, we'll go back to business as usual relatively quickly? How would you all respond to that?
Well, let me say that go ahead, Nina. I think she's muted.
Sorry, I was going to give you the floor, Dan, but I'll go very quickly. Absolutely. But I mean, I was reflecting back this morning on the last time there was a big relief package. This was back when President Obama was in office and Arne Duncan was the Secretary of Education, and the amount of energy the department spent in bringing philanthropy together to do a whole host of things that, for better or for worse, you know, were pretty transformative. I don't see that kind of dialogue currently taking place, and I think it's definitely time to have that, especially around the notion of one-to-one learning and the digital divide that this crisis has definitely kind of demonstrated or put to the forefront.
And I think that this pandemic has exposed, as Eva mentioned, the problems with our school systems and the inequity that exists in our school system. That it's not being addressed, and it hasn't been addressed, and now we see that it needs to be addressed. The inequity that exists among districts because of the way we fund education in this country. That has to be addressed first and foremost. But after that, I don't think we'll ever be back to the way it used to be. I think we've seen that online learning is the future, and here we are 20% into the 21st century, and we're still educating kids as if we were back in the 20th century. This is a time to move into the 21st century aggressively. So I think that we're going to begin thinking about the good things that were done during this process and how they need to be continued, and then questioning some of the things that we've been doing all along that we all of a sudden stopped doing. And guess what? The world didn't end. You know, the standardized tests that are administered every year are not being administered this year. Wow. You know, what's going to be the consequences of that? Kids that are applying to go into college and have to have their scores rank ordered and take all of these tests in order to be admitted. But that's not going to happen this year, yet colleges will admit these kids. So a lot of the things that are going to happen as a result of what's going on are not necessarily bad and could be an impetus as we think after this is all over. And I'm thinking the September of 2021 as the closest thing to normalcy that we're going to see. When we get back to that stage, what are the things that we're going to look at and say, you know what? There are some good things that happen as a result of that. Those things we ought to keep. There are some things that we were doing that we have to question whether we should continue doing.
So I'm going to combine two questions here. This is a little bit more tactical. There was a question for you, Eva, that was about how did success build teacher staff scheduling that requires sort of set upon time, and how did you balance that with the needs of your teachers? And then to all of you more generally, the second question came in, like, we just watched in LA these sort of marathon negotiations around between the union and the school district, which looked a lot like the marathon negotiations between the union and the school district that happened there even in normal times. And so the question is sort of, is that really the best use of our time and energy right now, or what needs to happen on the ground to prioritize the needs of kids immediately? So one of those is right to you, Eva, and the other one's to the three of you.
Sure. So in terms of standing up a teacher schedule, you know, we were watching this epidemic from afar, pandemic from afar, and we had a little more, not lead time by design, but it seemed pretty clear that we were going to have to close. And so about 2 weeks before we did, we started imagining what would virtual school look like, and how do we have a teacher's schedule. And we really started to think about what is the school leader's role in this new virtual world, what is the teacher's role, what is the kids' role, what is the parents' role, and really sketched all that out and designed a schedule that would optimize all of our constituencies. And we did that while having a very explicit value system, which for us is that reading is a priority K-12. Conceptual math is a priority K-12. And we took all of our educational values and we stood them up against a constrained remote virtual school, and we crashed those things together, and that's what our virtual school looks like.
Anyone else? That's a hard pass on the labor union one. Okay, labor management. Okay.
Well, I don't think it's just about labor, Andy. Yes,
no, labor and management. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's a, you know, you're a good flamethrower, so that I'll take that. But look, I will say this, and I think this is true across the board. And people, I've been asked this question at least 20 times since this began. Like, what will be different? How can we change? And unfortunately, being a student of history, and there's a deliberate reason I'm married to a glass half full kind of guy, because, you know, I think human nature is human nature, and we have gone through a whole lot, and there are still certain things that have not changed, right? We've been through world wars, and, you know, we went from slavery to Jim Crow, right? And so we change for a little bit, and then we quickly go back. I think the hope is, from my standpoint, that the light that is shown on things that work, on particularly as somebody who serves and walked into and serves large numbers of young people who are behind already. As Eva said, this wasn't just something that happened because of COVID-19. What I am hoping for is that the room in this space of the suspension of certain interests, be that union, be that federal, be that state politics, gets suspended long enough for us to get some insight into where is this acceleration of achievement working, right? What are those methods? How do we surface those? And then two, you know, it might sound too fuzzy on a call about academic achievement, but one of the things that we're finding that I don't think is a surprise, but it doesn't get talked as much about in the day-to-day of learning, is the number of our young people who are probably more engaged now because they have adults actually reaching out to them who care about where they are, families who are being contacted in ways that they were never contacted before. You know, we talked earlier about, you know, the whole IDEA, and I know that policy-wise, well, we haven't had a flare-up yet because we actually, and it was our legal team, we actually reached out to our special education advocates and said, work with us through this. Now, that doesn't mean we're gonna, you know, never have another lawsuit or anything like that. But I will say the willingness to be creative when you know everything is not perfect to me is where the pockets of promise are. And the same is true for our union. Like I'm sure we will continue to have places. I'm convinced that we disagree, and that's okay. But I will also say we have been able to partner on things and turn things around in certain areas much more quickly than we have before. So I don't, look, this country has a long arc, and we tend to like to institutionalize inequity. So I'm not holding a big parade yet, but I do think we have space to actually scale some things that we wouldn't have seen otherwise.
And I think around the country, you're hearing the kind of stories you're talking about people figuring out how to come together to solve, as much as you're hearing about some of the usual stuff flaring up. Nina, you mentioned philanthropy. A few people are interested. Like, how are you all feeling about the response from philanthropy this time around, and what do you need? And obviously, like Eva, you're more adjacent to philanthropy than some schools. But so like from your different perspectives, are you getting what you need, or what are things you'd like to see coming out of the philanthropic sector?
Well, my point earlier was really to the moments in time where you can bring philanthropy to align with national goals. If you recall, after 9/11, one of the reasons No Child Left Behind passed so quickly was because everyone wanted to come together and get rid of their differences to do something monumental. Again, in 2008, after that big package, you had Race to the Top and those things, and philanthropy really was involved in a lot of those discussions. Right now, I think a lot of what I've seen is definitely a flexibility, a sense of if you had a programmatic funding stream, you can use it for general operations purposes. And there have been some activities around kind of making internet and, computers available to schools, but I haven't seen anything coordinated national that brings everything together and connects the dots. Really, if online learning, having a Chromebook in every house is the thing that we need to do, there are just a lot of dots that need to be connected at the national level. So I see pockets of hope and improvement and flexibility, certainly, but there hasn't been one coordinated place, and that's potentially also because politically, usually you have a president or someone like that that brings these things together, and that hasn't happened. But let me just say, Silicon schools just recently put out a playbook. I encourage everyone who's listening to this to please go to their website and take a look at it. It has a lot of great resources for those that want to do online learning well, including school districts, not just charter.
Let's stay on that for a sec. I'm just curious, and there's a couple of questions that have come in like this. I'm going to band them together. One was for you, Eva, explicitly that it says you've been a thoughtful skeptic of technology. Has this changed your views? And I would just put that to everybody. How has the experience of just the past few weeks changed how your views in any kind of different way, positively, negatively, change your views on online learning and technology and education?
Yeah, I have some sort of strong views on that. I mean, I don't ever want to be, even before this, I never want to be a Luddite. I think technology can be very powerful and useful. And I'm very, very grateful that for our 4th through 12th graders, we had a one-to-one. But when I was an elected official and chaired the education committee, I saw certainly the district of the city of New York spend literally billions of dollars on technology, and it was not effectively used. And just because you have a one-to-one does not mean that you have good curriculum, etc. And if there was only one thing I could do as a school leader, I couldn't do anything other than one thing, it would be reading. And books online are incredibly cheap. And sometimes we don't do the cheap things first. We do the fancy high-tech things, and then we don't have kids reading. What I love about Audible books or online books is listening to books. Even if you cannot read, that has profound educational advantages, and yet we're not resourceful in this country in taking advantage of the libraries in this country that have free online resources. And part of the reason we're not able to take advantage is not a technological one. It goes back to something Sonja said about a culture of achievement. You have to have a culture of attendance, a culture of achievement. Otherwise, the resources are not going to be fully utilized. And I think we, long before Corona, we didn't invest enough in that culture to take advantage of the resources.
Others, and I know several of you have seen this you've worked on the publishing or the vendor side on this, you've worked in schools, like has this experience changed how you, Dan, Nina, Sonja, how you think about education technology?
Well, I have to tell you that I'm very impressed and grateful for how many of our companies have stepped up. Our publishing companies, our software companies have all stepped up and basically made their products available for free. A lot of the online programs are available for free. So districts have been able to take advantage of that right now. And use that material without having to worry about the cost of purchasing, et cetera. And again, a lot of our foundations have donated millions of dollars to provide the computers for the kids that need them and do a lot of these things. So it's impressive the way that people have stepped up to help in this factor. And let me just take the opportunity at this point to thank all of our educators, to thank all of our teachers, to thank all of you that are in the school, Sonja and Eva. Nina, you and I are out in left field for the great work that you're all doing. And, you know, everything that we can do to support your efforts is terrific. We're proud of the work that you all do.
What are these adjustments that are being made from the pandemic? So like a number of things, like the ways education is being delivered, changes in flexibility and operations within districts, all these different things. How likely do you all think these will be to become permanent features of education? And how likely do you think we'll just kind of go back to organization business as it was, whether it's 2020 or 2021 when things get back to normal? Like how will this change us or how will it not?
Well, Andy, to Eva's point, I agree that technology is not the end-all be-all solution. And there are some districts that are doing remote learning without technology. So it's not just about the hardware, but the mechanism you have through which to communicate, whether it's through PBS or some other mechanism where your teachers are calling you at home directly to see if you're doing certain things. I do think, though, that the whole discussion of distance learning and, you know, seat time, I do hope that a lot of states will look to a state like New Hampshire or to a school system like Miami-Dade a little bit more carefully, because they have had these built-in structures that just make it easier to react to this. And we all know, and I've heard this before, and this pandemic may kind of slow down this summer, but it's likely to pick back up, and you do want to be ready. I do think the fact that this is front and center is definitely an incentive for people to act quickly. So I'm optimistic, but the fact that every state is going to have to make their decision on their own is going to be a kind of a stumbling block here, because a lot of these legislatures have also gone home, and it's unclear when they're going to come back and if this is going to be ready for them to consider when they're back, if the advocacy community is ready to push some of these things forward.
Sonja, how do you think, like, in terms of what you're doing in Baltimore, how much this is going to stick? Oh, sorry, Nina, you're muted.
The one thing I'll just say, though, some of the waivers around testing, I hope those don't stay in place. I mean, you know, to the extent we've given as states a pass on annual testing and all that, those are the waivers and things that I hope will go back into place quickly.
Dan, was that a thumbs up on that, or are you just touching your face like none of us are supposed to?
No, I was just touching my face. That was definitely not a thumbs up.
Sonja, in Baltimore, like, how do you think this is going to change, and sort of you being just representative of an urban district? How is this going to, are these changes going to stick and change how you do things when things come back to normal, or not?
No, I think some of them will. And some of that is because our families are now having a different set of experiences, right? So previously, I think related to, you know, what Ava said, we were focused on how do we get reading instruction right? Like that was our focus. It wasn't how do we buy laptops for every student. But I will tell you, our families are now feeling a divide that was kind of distant. It was, you know, we know some folks over here somewhere have access to something that we don't, and now it has come front and center. And so I do think it is going to shift community expectations about access to technology in ways that were not front and center in a lot of urban school districts. Again, and I'm glad that we're shouting out my colleague in Miami-Dade, because I do think they've done some great work on this. But the large number of my colleagues, and I'm sure Dan has this for non-large urban school districts. I sit and hear my rural colleagues in the state of Maryland, and they're saying something similar, like this divide, families are feeling it. And I think their expectation level, which I encourage, is at a different place. That being said, having 3 daughters myself with 3 very different online experiences, I can tell you that nothing is going to take the place of the quality of interaction, of questioning, of how rigorous the content is. If it is online busy work, if it is a Google Classroom only to cue into, some kind of low-level engagement, then it's going to go by the wayside. I think what we're seeing, though, and I say this often, it should not be that with certain communities, we make a choice of either or. So I resist and reject every kind of, do we do technology or do we do high quality instruction? It's a both and so for me, it is both of that. But I will say, again, 3 daughters, 3 very different experiences with distance learning, as they're in 3 different schools. And I will tell you, the technology is fabulous, but if you do not have a skilled educator who understands how to use it and knows their content deeply, keep your Chromebook and give me the high quality teacher any day of the week. So we're going to have to have a both and discussion, not an either or.
So staying on that, and not to end on a down note, but I think this is a big piece of the challenge. So some kids are engaging in online in different ways. We've been talking about that. Some districts are doing sort of very creative things with distance, but a lot of kids were sent home with either nothing or with packets and so forth that are wildly inadequate to the amount of learning loss that they could experience over this time, particularly the most marginalized kids. So can you all talk about sort of going forward, what are some of the steps that you want to see taken either by the public sector, the government, philanthropy, to address that, which seems to be sort of an emerging and fairly serious, if not catastrophic, situation for a lot of families?
Well, I think first and foremost, we've addressed this a number of times, is with the inequity. You can't talk about online learning to people who don't have the connectivity and don't have the laptop. So you have to have the laptop and you have to have the connectivity in order for these things to take place. And that's a big miss right now. That's going to have to be corrected if we're going to be continuing with this through this coming school year.
But do you see that getting corrected, like in time, even for like the summer, let alone the rest of the end of the school year? Like, so my question is a little bit more like, what do we do? I think everybody on the panelists would all agree. I know I would agree that we need to address the digital divide and broadband access, but like, that's going to take some time. Like, what immediately do we need to be doing to make sure that more kids are staying connected to school?
So we have been thinking probably since week 2 concurrently about what I've called educational recovery, as much as, whatever we call this current state of COVID-19. And part of what we are beginning to have conversations with, and I would say some of our best philanthropic partners are those who are willing to hear from the ground, not kind of stay with their predetermined educational pet project, but the ones who have been alongside us and thinking, we are saying, okay, is this the time to really think of time differently in schools structurally? Is this, like, how are we actually taking 2 of our best high school principals who figured out in a matter of days how to individualize student needs, prioritize those at a high school level in ways we hadn't done before, and actually use that then to feed information for which students get targeted support? How do we, I'm fascinated by how Eva and her team are working on this, taking the best teachers, the most successful teachers, and putting them in front of kids who need it most. We've talked about, is there a way to do that through technology now so that we are accelerating the learning faster, because we do know, even in a district of 80,000 kids, we know based on our data who our teachers are that are getting 2-3 years worth of gains in 1 year, and how do we expand student exposure to that. So for us, our education recovery plan really began very shortly after this whole thing started to blow, because we knew the kids that are now a year or two behind are going to quickly become kids who are 3 years behind if we don't begin really putting in place some of the best acceleration success we have. And quite frankly, it is political to have the best teacher teach the lowest kids across 160 schools. Like the Ed Trust research was really clear that, you know, achievement gaps or access to quality teaching is larger within classes in a school than it is actually between schools. And so how do we begin pushing on some of those things? But we actually have begun planning for that recovery stage because it's inevitable.
Andy, I apologize, but I'm going to have to leave. I'm already like 6 minutes late for another
Appreciate it.
webinar I'm
We
supposed to be
started
on.
late, we ran over. Actually, I think
Yeah.
that is a good place to end it. I guess we can't have like virtual applause, but I suspect everybody would applaud you. And on behalf of Bellwether, I want to thank you all so much for your time, contributing what you're learning, what you're doing, and what you're seeing more generally. So thank you all very much, and please keep up the good work.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.